The lecture hall froze the moment Marcus picked up the chalk, every eye burning into him, not with curiosity but with scorn. "That's the janitor's son," someone whispered, laughter rippling like poison. The professor had already failed the equation, but Marcus's hand moved with unshakable calm, and just as the final line of his proof glowed across the board, someone shouted from the back, "He cheated." Would the truth save him, or bury him alive? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lecture hall was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that only follows an expectation shattered. Rows of students leaned forward in their seats, notebooks open, pens frozen above half-written lines of formulas. The board at the front of the room was littered with chalk dust and incomplete fragments of equations, like a battlefield of numbers where victory had slipped away. Professor Daniel Whitmore, known throughout the state as a man who could reduce the most intricate problem into elegant solutions, stood with chalk trembling slightly in his hand. He was tall, polished, with a reputation built on decades of intellectual dominance. Yet in this moment, under the blinding fluorescent lights, his polished exterior cracked. The problem written across the board remained stubborn, unsolvable by even his trained mind. Whitmore tried to mask his failure with a faint smile. "This equation," he said, clearing his throat, "is an excellent demonstration of complexity. Sometimes we must accept that solutions take time." His words, though measured, carried an unfamiliar fragility. He was not a man used to admitting limits. The students shifted in their seats. Some hid smirks behind their notebooks. Others exchanged quick glances that whispered louder than words. If the great Professor Whitmore couldn't solve it, who could? The myth of infallibility had cracked open before their eyes. From the far corner of the hall, Marcus Hill sat quietly, blending into the shadowed row of back seats. At 19, he was a freshman still finding his footing in the overwhelming corridors of Ivywood University. He was not dressed in the branded hoodies or fitted blazers that marked the sons and daughters of privilege. His clothes were plain, practical, slightly faded, the kind of wardrobe stitched together by necessity, not choice. Marcus kept his head low, but his eyes never strayed from the chalkboard. Numbers fascinated him. Equations whispered to him in ways words never could. To Marcus, mathematics was less about solving and more about seeing, the way patterns formed, the way symmetry emerged from chaos, the way a solution always lay hidden, waiting for the right eyes to find it. But as his gaze lingered on the unfinished equation, he felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken judgments around him. He didn't belong here. At least, that's what everyone made sure he remembered. Marcus's father, Samuel Hill, was the university's longest-serving janitor. For more than 25 years, Samuel had mopped these same lecture hall floors, emptied trash cans that overflowed with discarded brilliance, and dusted off desks where students like Marcus now sat. He was known, but not respected, acknowledged only as the man who cleaned up after geniuses. And Marcus, by extension, carried that invisible label, the janitor's son. The whispers began small, barely audible over the hum of silence. "Look, he's staring like he actually gets it. Janitor's kid, right? Probably thinks he's Einstein. Imagine him solving it. What a joke." The words cut, sharp and deliberate, each one embedding itself in Marcus's chest. He kept his eyes fixed on the board, pretending not to hear, but every syllable rang clear. This was not new. It was the soundtrack of his life at Ivywood. Mockery delivered with a smile, disdain dressed as casual observation. Racism here wasn't always shouted. It dripped, subtle and insidious, into every interaction. Professor Whitmore's chalk finally snapped in half, the tiny piece clattering against the floor. He sighed, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Well," he said softly, "it appears we must end here for today. I'll prepare additional material for our next session." It was an admission of defeat. The room buzzed with disbelief. Some students laughed under their breath. Others scribbled notes furiously, as though recording the moment for memory. For the first time in decades, the professor who never faltered had stumbled. Marcus's heart raced. He knew the answer. The pattern had unfolded in his mind minutes ago. As naturally as a melody resolves itself in music, every variable clicked into place, every symbol fell into rhythm. To him, the path forward was as clear as sunlight through a window, yet he sat frozen, pinned by the knowledge of what would happen if he moved. If he raised his hand, the whispers would turn into laughter. If he stood, they would cut him down, If he dared to solve what the professor could not, the spotlight would sear instead of illuminate. But something stronger than fear began to stir inside him. His father's voice, worn but steady, echoed in his memory. Son, the world will always tell you what you can't be. Don't let them be right. The professor dropped the broken chalk on the tray, turning toward the class with weary eyes. Mathematics humbles us all. In time, his attempt at dignity landed heavy, almost tragic. In the corner, Marcus inhaled sharply, his fingers curled into fists against his notebook. The whispers around him had grown bolder, testing the edges of cruelty. Bet his dad's outside waiting with a mop. Yeah, maybe he can clean this mess off the board instead of solving it. The laughter, low but piercing, spread like a virus. Marcus's face burned, not with shame, but with something hotter, an anger forged from years of watching his father bow his head to disrespect. The injustice wasn't just mathematical. It was personal, generational, systemic. Professor Whitmore finally lowered his eyes. Defeated. Class dismissed, he said quietly, his voice breaking the spell of silence. Students began gathering their belongings, chatter flooding the room again. But Marcus didn't move. His gaze was still locked on the board. For one fragile moment, the noise of the world faded, and all that existed was the equation. The chalk abandoned on the tray seemed to call to him. His pulse thundered in his ears as he rose from his seat. A ripple spread through the room. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. The janitor's son was standing. He took one step forward, then another, his body tense but unwavering. Each movement drew sharper whispers.
What's he doing?
Sit down, janitor boy. No way. He's not. Professor Whitmore looked up, startled. His tired eyes widened in confusion as Marcus approached. Young man, he began, but his voice faltered. Marcus reached the front row, his hand brushing the edge of the desk where countless scholars had rested before. He felt their weight pressing down on him, every barrier that told him he did not belong. And yet he kept walking. The chalkboard loomed, the unfinished equation daring him to try. Marcus extended his hand, hesitating for a heartbeat. The whispers sharpened, the mockery grew, but beneath it all, a strange silence waited. With his father's voice echoing in his chest, Marcus took one final step toward the board. Professor Whitmore, defeated, lowered his chalk. In that instant, Marcus's fingers closed around the piece of chalk resting on the tray. The entire room held its breath as the janitor's son faced the unsolved equation. The lecture hall emptied, leaving behind the faint smell of chalk dust and the ghost of laughter that still clung to the air. Marcus had returned to his seat, his fingers dusted with white from the chalk he'd dared to touch. He hadn't written anything yet, just holding it had been rebellion enough. For that moment, he had stood where no one expected him to, and the image of him stepping toward the board would linger in the minds of his classmates like a rumor they couldn't explain. But Marcus's story didn't begin there. It had been written long before, in the quiet corners of campus hallways, where his father's footsteps echoed long after the students had gone. Samuel Hill had been part of Ivywood University longer than most of the professors who strutted its halls. 25 years of pushing brooms, fixing squeaky desks, polishing floors until they reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. To many he was invisible, the background figure who kept their environment clean without ever disturbing their comfort. To others he was a target for their quiet prejudices, a reminder of where they believed people like him belonged. Students would leave half-eaten food on the floor and mutter as Samuel passed, "That's his job anyway." Professors, some polite and others curt, often spoke to him without looking up, as though his existence was inconvenient noise in their day. When budgets tightened, his overtime hours were the first cut, and when promotions were whispered about from maintenance supervisors, his name never surfaced. Yet behind Samuel's steady hands and lowered eyes burned a mind that had once held dreams. In his youth, Samuel had been a math prodigy in his own right. Numbers had always been his language, his sanctuary. He had once dreamed of teaching, of chalkboards and lectures, of proving theorems that no one had solved. But those dreams had collided with the barriers of racism, in ways that left scars deeper than rejection letters. In high school, Samuel's counselor had dismissed his interest in advanced math, steering him toward more realistic trades. Scholarships that should have been his were quietly handed to others. Professors he admired had told him, with patronizing smiles, that while he was gifted, academia was not a good fit for someone of his background. By the time he reached adulthood, those doors had slammed so many times that he no longer knocked. Life forced him into the shadows of the very halls where he once imagined himself leading. The irony stung daily, cleaning chalkboards he should have been writing on, polishing floors beneath students who would never know his name. But Samuel was not bitter, not in the way that corrodes a man. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, pouring everything he had left into raising Marcus. His son was his second chance, the living embodiment of dreams deferred. At home, their world was modest. A two-bedroom apartment with walls that carried the smell of lemon polish, Samuel brought home from work. They didn't have much, but what they had was built on discipline and love. Samuel was strict but never cruel, demanding Marcus keep his grades high, his focus sharper than any distraction the world threw at him. "You've got to be twice as good to get half as far," Samuel would often say, his deep voice carrying the weight of lived truth. "That's the tax this world places on us. But you, son, you're going to pay it, and you're going to climb anyway." Marcus listened, absorbing his father's wisdom like oxygen. He watched the way Samuel endured insults without striking back, how he turned silence into armor. At times, Marcus wanted to scream for him, to demand the world see his father's worth. But Samuel would only shake his head. "Don't waste your energy teaching blind men to see," he would say. "Save it for building something they can't ignore." Still, the injustice gnawed at Marcus. He knew his father's brilliance had been buried beneath years of mops and buckets. He knew Samuel had once loved numbers the way Marcus loved them now, and in that hidden connection, father and son were bound by something stronger than circumstance, an inheritance of intellect too bright to be smothered by prejudice. One evening, the quiet of their apartment was broken by the sound of scratching pencils. Samuel entered Marcus's small room to find his son hunched over a worn notebook, pages filled with equations sprawling across the paper like veins on a leaf. The desk lamp cast a circle of light that caught Marcus's intense expression, brows furrowed, lips pressed tight, eyes burning with the same fire Samuel once saw in his own reflection decades ago. "Son," Samuel said softly, leaning against the doorframe, "you've been at it for hours." Marcus didn't look up. "I can't stop, Dad. It's like the problem won't let me go." Samuel walked closer, peering over his son's shoulder. His eyes scanned the lines of symbols and calculations. The breath caught in his chest. This wasn't the scribbling of a boy experimenting with math homework. This was precision. This was insight. This was brilliance unfolding in real time. Marcus was working through the very equation that had humiliated Professor Whitmore earlier that day. The old chalkboard still haunted Samuel's mind. He had been outside the lecture hall when the murmurs spilled out, catching fragments of laughter at the professor's expense. He hadn't known the full story then. Now standing over Marcus, he realized something extraordinary. His son had not only seen the problem, but was dissecting it with clarity that defied expectation. "Marcus," Samuel's voice trembled, rare for a man who carried himself with steady calm. "Where did you learn this?" Marcus finally looked up, his eyes wide, almost guilty. "I just saw it. When Professor Whitmore couldn't solve it, the answer started forming in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about it, Dad. I had to write it down before it disappeared." Samuel's heart pounded. A storm of pride, fear, and grief surged within him. He recognized this gift, because it was the very one he'd been forced to bury. But for Marcus, it was alive, pulsing, demanding to be seen. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing gently. "You've got something powerful in you, boy. But you need to be careful. The world doesn't like when brilliance comes from the places they don't expect." Marcus stared back, his young face shadowed by determination. "Then maybe it's time they learn to expect it." Samuel swallowed hard. He wanted to believe his son's fire could withstand the storm, but he also knew what storms could do. And as his eyes drifted back to the pages filled with flawless logic, he realized with bone-deep certainty that Marcus wasn't just playing with numbers. He was solving what Ivywood's most celebrated mind had failed to grasp. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he leaned closer. The equation on Marcus's notebook was complete, perfect, undeniable. His son had solved the very problem that had left the great Professor Whitmore defeated. Morning light spilled across the kitchen linoleum, like a quiet confession. Samuel stood at the counter, tying his work boots with the same practiced efficiency he used to knot invisible grief. Marcus sat at the small table, the notebook closed in front of him as if it were a sleeping animal that might bolt if woken. The night's revelations sat between them, radiant and dangerous. "You got two choices today," Samuel said, eyes on the laces. Lay low and let the noise pass. Or walk straight through the noise and make the noise learn your name. Marcus glanced at the notebook. I wasn't trying to make noise, Dad. I know. Samuel's voice softened. But truth don't ask permission before it echoes. They left the apartment and parted at the campus gates. As Marcus crossed the brick courtyard, he felt it immediately, heads turning, conversations tapering off, smirks blooming. The campus had a choreography for scandal, and it performed with cruel grace. He checked his phone and saw why the Ivywood Confidential meme page had posted a grainy photo of him in the back row yesterday. Captioned, "Janitor's boy tries to teach math daddy how to count." The comments scrolled like a cascade of cut glass. Dude thinks he's Good Will Hunting.
LMAO, where's his mop?
Bet he can solve fractions when they're called shifts. Marcus shoved the phone back into his pocket. He felt the heat in his chest, almost embarrassed by how much it hurt. He had long ago learned to separate insult from identity, but learning doesn't make bleeding painless. On the quad, two students leaned against the statue of Ivywood's founder. One of them, in a varsity jacket, didn't bother lowering his voice. Heard Whitmore flopped, and the janitor's kid started, like reaching for the chalk. That's comedy gold. The other snorted. Man, if I were Whitmore, I'd transfer schools. Marcus kept walking. He would not give them the satisfaction of a flinch. In linear algebra, the energy tightened another notch. The TA, a pale graduate student named Aiden, with the brittle confidence of someone whose power was borrowed, clicked through slides without looking at the class. Before we start, he muttered, just a note about academic humility. It's important not to perform intelligence you don't possess. Mathematics is earned, not mimicked. A ripple of laughter broke across the room. Marcus stared at the equation on the projector, mindlessly copying it down while the subtext carved itself into his ribs. After class he stood to leave, but Aiden stepped in front of him with a smile that never met his eyes. Hey Marcus, right? Maybe, keep your head down in Whitmore's lecture. He's under scrutiny, no need to complicate things. I didn't do anything, Marcus said. Exactly. Aiden's tone turned syrupy. Let's both stick to what we can handle. The hallway outside was a funnel of whispers. Someone slid by him and bumped his shoulder. Not an accident, not a fight, just the prioritization of their space over his. He steadied himself and kept moving. At the student union, TV screens looped the campus news station. A chirpy anchor said, "In surprising developments, Professor Daniel Whitmore." Yes, the Daniel Whitmore was stumped yesterday by a complex problem. Rumors claim a janitor's son attempted to intervene. Faculty sources assure us the equation is a known trick, and any alleged solution from students would be derivative at best. Faculty sources, Marcus repeated under his breath, stung by the careful cruelty. Derivative at best. They had found a way to insult him without saying his name. He took the long route to the library to avoid the crowds, cutting behind the science building where the delivery trucks unloaded. The cinder block wall kept the campus noise at bay. For a minute, the only sound was the hiss of a sprinkler rotating its obedience across a patch of grass. A text pinged his phone. An unknown number. Heard you solved Whitmore's mess. Brave of you to pretend. He deleted it. Another came. He's a national figure. Don't embarrass yourself. He blocked it, but the messages arrived like hydra heads, each new number replacing the last. In the library, he took a seat by the tall windows. The glass made the sky look like a solved problem. Clean, uncomplicated. He opened his notebook and traced the logic he'd written the night before. Every step still held. He tested it like a bridge. It did not creak. A shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see Professor Meredith Sloan from the economics department, famous for columns about meritocracy, infamous for comments that reduced people to pie charts. She smiled as if they were old friends. Marcus, is it? I wanted to offer you some advice. He closed the notebook halfway. I don't remember asking. She ignored the edge. Visibility can be dangerous when you're not ready. Smart boys get crushed when they step into arenas built for men. He kept his voice even. Smart boys build new arenas. Sloane's smile chilled. Then prepare for inspection. She tapped the notebook, a touch just too familiar, and walked away, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and condescension. Marcus exhaled through his nose, then turned the page and wrote a single line to steady himself. Truth doesn't need applause. He could hear his father's voice saying it, low, steady, sheltering. The afternoon brought its uglier chorus. On a public forum, a thread sprouted. Is affirmative action teaching math now? The comments blurred into a sludge. Dog whistles, fake concern, naked contempt. Some claimed he'd stolen notes. Some that his father had accessed files while cleaning, as if a mop was a master key to theorems. A rumor took hold that Professor Whitmore had gently asked him not to interfere, and Marcus had acted out. Lies replicate faster than facts, especially when the truth threatens the hierarchy that feeds them. He didn't tell Samuel everything. There was a limit to the hurt a son should hand back to the parent who already carried too much. Still, his father found him at dusk, outside the old math building where Ivy climbed the stone like calligraphy. Samuel's uniform shirt was damp from the day. He studied his son's face with an accuracy honed over 19 years. "Tell me the part you ain't saying," Samuel murmured. Marcus looked at the steps, the worn grooves from a century of feet. They're trying to make the story match their comfort. If Whitmore fails, it's a blip. If I see a pattern, it's a prank. Samuel nodded slowly. They ain't scared you wrong. They scared you right. There's a difference. What if I'm the one who makes it complicated? Marcus asked, surprising himself with the honesty. What if I put a target on us? You didn't put it there, Samuel said. You just lit it up so they could see their own aim. A first-year girl walked by, glanced at Marcus, and looked away quickly. Shame or fear or learned distance. He couldn't tell. The sun dropped lower, and the campus lights blinked on, each lamp a quiet verdict. When night settled, Marcus retreated to the library again. The upper floors were nearly empty, and the hush felt like permission. He copied his solution cleanly, into a fresh notebook, line by line, making sure every symbol was clear, every transition anchored. He wasn't hiding. He was documenting. An unexpected ping, a campus-wide email from Professor Whitmore. The subject line, on humility. Marcus opened it. Dear students, today I was reminded that mathematics resists arrogance. Failure is instructive. I appreciate the engagement of all who care about the work. We return to the board tomorrow with clearer eyes. It was diplomatic, almost brave, and it made Marcus ache. The message wasn't the shield people would assume. It was an invitation to gather around Whitmore's fall and pretend it was a communal lesson. Except some falls cost more depending on who you are. The replies rolled in. One student wrote, "We're with you, Professor." Another, "Ignore the noise." A faculty member added, "Yes, the theater of defiance from certain quarters shouldn't distract us." The ellipsis did more damage than slurs. He closed the email and turned off the screen to watch the reflection of the stacks extend into the dark window. That was when he sensed movement at his peripheral, a figure at the end of the aisle, too still to be a student browsing. The figure didn't approach. It waited. A test or a courtesy. Marcus stood, closed his notebook, and walked toward the shadow. As he neared, the figure revealed the shape of a blazer and a careful posture. Not a student, not campus police, a faculty member, but one he couldn't play. Marcus Hill? The voice was gentle, genderless in the way that empathy can be. He couldn't see their face clearly, only the brief glint of spectacles, the careful distance of someone who knows how much distance matters. Yes, he said. A white envelope appeared between them, the way a stagehand might pass a prop without wanting applause. No one asked me to do this, the person said, and I'm not asking your permission to care, but I would like you to consider an invitation. What is it? Marcus kept his tone steady. A room where solutions matter more than surnames. The figure placed the envelope on a cart of returned books. Don't thank me. Just decide. Marcus didn't reach until the person had turned away. He picked up the envelope, the weight of it surprisingly precise. The flap had no return address, only his name in meticulous handwriting. He slid a finger beneath the paper and opened it, heart pounding, resolve bracing itself against hope. Inside was a single card, ivory and spare. Ivywood Mathematics Symposium. Live problem session. Friday 7 p.m. Presenters by invitation only. Below it a handwritten line. Your work deserves light. Bring your notebook. He let the card rest on his palm, feeling for the first time that day a thread of something like oxygen. A second card slipped free, so thin he hadn't noticed it at first. It wasn't part of the invitation. It was a photocopy of a faculty email. Redacted names. Subject line stark. Re-strategy. If Hill attempts to present. The excerpt read. Discredit swiftly. Question provenance. Frame as performance. Protect the brand. Marcus stared at the words until they doubled. From the end of the aisle, the faculty member's voice carried softly, already halfway gone. It's not paranoia if they've rehearsed it. Before he could call out, the figure disappeared down the stairwell, leaving only the whisper of shoes and the pulse of the exit light. Marcus looked down at the invitation, then at the copied email that smelled faintly of toner and secrecy. For a moment, he felt the old fear, the one that said this was bigger than him. Then he heard his father's voice again, the sentence that had always been both warning and blessing. Truth doesn't need applause. He closed his fist around the invitation, the paper yielding like a vow. As he slipped the card into his notebook, a new email landed in his inbox. This one from an official address he recognized. Mr. Hill, we need to speak about your conduct in yesterday's lecture. Please report to the department office at 8 a.m. Do not bring outside material. The email summoned him to the department office at dawn, but the invitation tugged him toward evening. Marcus slept barely an hour, his mind split between a threat and a promise. At 8 a.m., he faced a semicircle of administrators in muted ties, who used words like decorum, optics, and chain of inquiry, as if language itself could handcuff him. They asked him to confirm that he had not attempted to undermine a senior professor. They asked him, pointedly, to leave his notebook at home for the rest of the week while tensions cooled. I didn't disrupt anything, Marcus said, palms open, voice steady. I stood up. The associate chair, a woman with a precise smile, replied, sometimes standing up is the same as stepping out of line. Samuel waited in the hallway, knuckles pressed into his palm. When Marcus emerged, his father searched his face. They want you quiet, Samuel said. They want me invisible, Marcus answered. Tonight I'm going to be seen. By late afternoon, the campus transformed. The old lecture theater, where the symposium would be held. Chapman Hall glowed with brass sconces and self-importance. Marcus walked the path with his notebook tucked under his jacket, the invitation card rigid against his ribs. The steps of Chapman were crowded with scholars, dressed in identical success, dark suits, polished shoes, silk scarves. Laughter rang like cutlery. He climbed the stairs anyway. At the doors, a student volunteer in a blazer stopped him with a polite checkpoint smile. Presenters only, she chirped. Marcus held out the invitation. I'm presenting. She looked down, then up, then down again, as if the paper and the person didn't match. One moment. She flagged a man in a name badge. He examined the card, then the boy. New rule for tonight, the man said. No outside materials allowed inside the hall. All work must be demonstrated live. From memory. House policy. Marcus felt the warning from the morning flare like a bruise. That wasn't on the invitation, he said. House policy, the man repeated, as if the building itself had spoken. Samuel put a hand on his son's shoulder. You good? Marcus slipped the notebook back under his jacket. The words from the photocopied email flashed in his mind. Discredit swiftly. Question provenance. He looked at the door guard and said, I'll work from the board. Inside, the auditorium smelled like varnish and old applause. A raised chalkboard spanned the front wall, its surface washed clean, a stage waiting for proof. The rows filled with professors and donors, their whispers rolling in the domed ceiling, like weather. A scattering of students hid in the back rows, phones ready. On stage, a banner declared, Ivywood Mathematics Symposium, live problem session. Professor Daniel Whitmore stood at the aisle end, talking quietly to a dean. He looked older up close, hair more salt than silver, eyes rimmed with a sleepless red. He turned, caught sight of Marcus, and hesitated, just enough to register surprise, but not enough to grant recognition. Professor, Marcus said, stopping a polite distance away. Whitmore nodded once, guarded. Mr. Hill, I got an invitation. So I see. The professor's gaze flicked to the doors. The crowd, the board, like a seasoned pilot checking instruments in turbulence. Are you prepared to work live? I am. A dry swallow. Good. He stepped aside, expression unreadable, then let the ideas speak. The moderator, a physics chair with a theater actor's poise, took the podium. Welcome, he boomed. Tonight we celebrate mathematics in its living form. Risk taken in public, discovery attempted in the bright light. He gestured grandly. We'll begin with an open challenge. A complex unresolved equation that sparked spirited debate this week. Anyone may approach the board. Let us see where reason leads. Two faculty members rose almost in sync, their movements rehearsed. Professor Sloan from economics, perfume and pie charts, joined a mathematician named Garrity, whose tie looked like a graph of rising markets. They stood at the board, each trying a different path, annotating the left margin with signs of intellectual labor, brackets, side notes, assurances to the audience that the process mattered more than the finish. They crossed out lines, conferred in hushed, performative tone. After 12 minutes, Garrity capped the chalk like a pen, and said, "It's a dead end for this approach. For now." Applause. Courteous, protective. Another volunteer stepped up, a postdoc with hope on his sleeve. His hands shook, lines wavered, and he retreated with a red face to consoling pats. In the fourth row, Aidan the TA cleared his throat to a colleague. "He'll burn if he tries," he said. "Watch." Marcus kept his breathing measured. The equation, towering and deceptively simple in its first line, threaded its challenge across the board like a dare. He knew the curve it needed, the hinge where the door would swing. The moderator scanned the audience. Anyone else? A few seconds stretched into a chasm. Samuel leaned close to Marcus, speaking from just behind his shoulder. "If the door opens, walk through it." Marcus rose. The row tightened with a collective intake of breath, like a ribbon pulled taut. Some faces recoiled in reflex. Others sharpened with curiosity. He made the slow descent to the aisle, shoes clicking against the stone steps like metronome ticks. He stepped onto the stage. The chalk tray glinted. He could feel the audience's stare as a temperature. The moderator smoothed his tie. "Your name?" "Marcus Hill," he said, voice even. A murmur rippled. The moderator masked a flinch and gestured to the board. "Proceed." Marcus stood a foot from the surface, chalk resting cool and dusty in his fingers. He did not rush. He found the spine of his breath, the rhythm his father taught him for hard moments. Inhale truth, exhale noise. He wrote the first line not as an attack, but an invitation to the proof that already lived complete in his mind. "Interesting," someone muttered 3 rows back, the tone a wager against him. He set the frame. A reframing transformation that had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. He wrote the second line, pivoting toward a constraint that looked like a trap, but was actually a keyhole. He moved the third symbol like a chess piece that makes the whole board resign. From the front row, Professor Whitmore's posture changed, chin lifting, shoulders squaring. Not pride, not yet, but attention unguarded. He leaned forward in his seat and whispered to the dean. "He's not guessing." Marcus's hand steadied. The hall's rustle fell away. He felt the room shift from dismissal to watchfulness in measurable degrees. Like a tide reversing, he carried the argument over the midline, where most had stalled, and poured it into an identity that closed the circuit. He did not look back. He did not pause to plead. He addressed the board as if it had always been his. Behind him, the whispers tried to hold their old shape and failed. "Did he memorize this?" "No. Your boy is deriving." He's not wrong." Professor Sloan hissed to Garrity. "There's a provenance issue here. Don't be dazzled." Garrity squinted. "Dazzled? I'm dealing with data." On stage, Marcus reached the hinge, a substitution that would either collapse his work or unwrap the knot. He thought of the morning's order, "Do not bring outside materials," and understood it as a trap designed to make him miss this exact turn. He drew the symbol slowly, exhaled, then pressed. The line opened like a door in a room he'd built in the dark. A single syllable leaked from someone's mouth. Samuel in the aisle let out such a careful breath. It barely registered as sound. Marcus moved through the final sequence with a stillness that read as grace. On line 16, his chalk tapped twice, a habit he picked up from watching his father tap a mop handle before switching directions. He lifted the chalk again, knowing the end was minutes away but feeling centuries inside him. At the back, a trio of donors murmured about decorum and performative bravery, trying to restore a social order that mathematics was erasing as it marched down the slate. Whitmore stood without meaning to. The dean tugged his sleeve. The old man didn't sit. Marcus set the penultimate line. Then the last. Each mark precise, each mark a refusal to be erased. He drew the final equality, a quiet full stop that echoed louder than any ovation. He stepped away so the board could be seen without his body blocking it. The proof held, every joint locked, each plank bearing weight. He turned, finally meeting the faces that had been studying him like a forgery turned artifact. Silence is not neutral. It can be awe. It can be denial. In Chapman Hall, it was a jury deliberating. The moderator wet his lips. We will, of course, need to verify. Verify what? Someone snapped, shock bleeding into irritation. It's self-contained. Aiden the TA looked sick. Professor Sloane's jaw worked, calculating. Garrity rubbed his forehead as if a headache would defend him from a revision of reality. Phones rose, the rustle of capturing. Samuel blinked hard, refusing to let his son blur. Marcus rested the chalk and let the quiet say what it wanted. In the front row, Whitmore spoke, low but clear. This is correct. The silence cracked. Some gasps, one scattered clap that died too early, a rustle of half-formed sentences. The moderator held up a palm for calm, but calm was not the shape of the moment anymore. Mr. Hill, he said, we appreciate your... A door at the back swung open with the slap of wood against wood. A figure strode in, late and theatrical, without trying. A senior faculty member in a dark suit that signaled the kind of power not listed on organizational charts. His gaze moved once across the board, then dropped to Marcus with a look that had nothing to do with math. He raised his voice so it carried to every corner. He cheated. The word detonated. The audience snapped toward the accusation like compass needles to false north. Sloane straightened, seizing a script tossed to her. Aiden exhaled, like he'd been waiting. Marcus held his ground, hands open at his sides, chest rising slow. He did not look at the door. He looked at the proof he'd built. He said softly, because softness could be stronger than a shout, look at the work. But the man at the back stepped down the aisle like a verdict descending. No notes allowed, yet he reproduces an unpublished solution from memory. Where did you see it first? In a professor's office, on a purloined draft, or did your father bring you something he cleaned from the trash? Samuel flinched at the word trash. Whitmore's face blanched. Phones rose higher. Hungry. The moderator fumbled. Sir, we're in the middle of a farce. The man stopped at the aisle's end, voice smooth as a blade. Unless you prefer your department's reputation dragged through tomorrow's papers under the headline, Ivywood endorses staged geniuses. Marcus felt the room tilt. This wasn't about a theorem anymore. It was about a hierarchy defending itself with whatever it could weaponize. He kept his eyes on the board, then on the crowd, then finally on the man who had named him a thief without evidence. Say your name, Marcus said, not as a dare but as a record. The man smiled without warmth. Dr. Everett Cole, interim vice provost for academic standards. From somewhere high in the rafters of the hall, a small, steady voice cut across the panic like a violin underneath drums. Standards require evidence, Dr. Cole. Heads turned, searching for the speaker. A faint figure in the back row, older composed, had risen with the careful tremor of someone accustomed to being invisible. Until the exact second that mattered, Marcus couldn't make out the face, just the posture. Not confrontational, not deferential, present. But Cole had done what he came to do. The word cheated now echoed in every corner. A ghost people would swallow whole if it meant they didn't have to change what they believed about who belongs at the board. The moderator glanced at the dean, then at Whitmore, realizing too late that his show had turned into a tribunal. He cleared his throat to speak. Marcus's jaw set. He felt Samuel's presence behind him, a gravity, a harbor. He stepped closer to the board, as if the proof itself could shield him. The chalk dust on his fingertips glowed under the lights like pollen. Look at the work, he repeated, louder. Look at the logic. It doesn't care who writes it. A beat held, one fragile heartbeat of possible fairness, before the room surged with voices willing to trade truth for comfort. The moderator raised his hand for order, but before he could regain control, Dr. Cole pointed at the final line and announced, I've seen that exact step in a confidential faculty draft, word for word. The hall erupted, as security moved toward the stage, and the lights dimmed, throwing Marcus's proof into shadows while a chorus rose around a single searing accusation. He cheated. The auditorium didn't so much erupt as curdle. The power dipped, the lights hummed back, and Chapman Hall became a chamber of accusation, where everything was illuminated except fairness. Security lingered at the base of the stage, as if mathematics might suddenly require handcuffs. The chalkboard, his chalkboard, was now a silhouette behind murmurs that hardened into position. Dr. Everett Cole stood in the aisle like a judge presiding over a ritual he'd rehearsed. You've seen the final step, he announced, because it's lifted from a confidential draft. This is not brilliance. This is theft. Marcus felt the heat rise beneath his skin, a flush he refused to let become shame. He kept his hands at his sides and said, steady as a mantra, look at the work. From the front row, Sloane folded her arms with clinical satisfaction. We are looking, she said, at a performance. Garrity squinted at the board, then at Marcus. If he never saw the draft, how did he land on the exact articulation? Because the articulation is inevitable if you follow the logic, Marcus said. He pointed to the earlier lines. This framing forces the identity. There aren't infinite flourishes here, just structure. The moderator cleared his throat, trying to gather shards of order. Let's proceed with decorum. Mr. Hill, the claim is simple. Originality. Can you prove that your solution is your own? A laugh from the back, thin, brittle. Someone whispered, he'll claim divine inspiration next. Samuel stood at the doorway, half in shadow, uniform still damp from a day that refused to end. He didn't make a sound, but his presence felt like ballast. He had learned a lifetime ago that there are rooms you enter without being invited, and rooms you are allowed to clean, but not to witness. Tonight he was witnessing everything. Professor Whitmore rose slowly, palms open. Age sat differently on him now. Less authority, more consequence. Dr. Cole, he said. With respect, the accusation requires naming the draft in question. Cole flashed a small, cold smile. A draft circulated for internal review. That's vague, Whitmore replied. Which internal? Which review? Sloane intervened with the silk of institutional tone. We don't disclose drafts to protect the integrity of peer evaluation. You know that, Daniel. Whitmore's jaw tensed at his first name performing intimacy. It didn't have. I also know integrity requires verification. The board shows a derivation from first principles. If we're accusing theft, we need more than smoke. Cole's eyes slid to Marcus. We have more than smoke. He turned to security. His notebook. Security hesitated. The hall went taut. The line between precaution and humiliation drawn in air. Marcus lifted his chin. My notebook stays with me. Cole's voice softened into something worse. If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to fear. Samuel stepped forward from the doorway, a quiet entering the aisle. That's a line people use when they want to search a boy before they search the truth. Cole didn't look at Samuel. He addressed the moderator. For the reputation of this institution, we must act. The moderator glanced at the dean, then at the donors, reading not ethics but wallets. Mr. Hill, he said, would you be willing to voluntarily show us your notes? It would ease concerns. Marcus thought of the morning directive. Do not bring outside materials. He thought of the photocopied email. Discredit swiftly. This wasn't a request for clarity. It was a move to control the narrative. No, he said. You banned materials. You don't get to change the rules because the result makes you uncomfortable. A wave of discomfort rolled the rows. Words like insubordinate and ungrateful threaded through it. Unspoken but heard. Garrity rubbed his temple. Then what do you propose, Mr. Hill? Judge the work, Marcus answered. Not my bloodline. Not my pocket. The proof stands on its own. Aiden, the TA, finally found his voice. It stands, conveniently. Convenience is a poor metric, Marcus replied. So is prejudice. The word hung. Heavy and exact. Sloane's mouth tightened. Be careful with allegations you can't substantiate. Careful? Samuel's voice startled them with its gentleness. Careful is what we've been for 25 years. You don't hear careful when it's whispered from a mop handle, but it knows your halls better than you do. A fissure ran through the room. For a heartbeat, some faces softened, not toward agreement, but toward seeing. Then the institutional reflex returned, putting everything back where it had been. Cole refocused the script. Even if the algebra holds, provenance matters. We are not a busker's corner. This is a university. We must safeguard standards. Standards, Whitmore murmured, almost to himself as if the word had changed meaning without telling him. The moderator reached for the microphone, voice set to neutral. Here is a path forward. We can appoint a small committee to review the derivation in private. Private? A thin, older voice cut him off. The figure from the rafters stepped into visibility. A man with silver hair and a cane that he didn't lean on as much as conduct with. His suit was neat, but not new. His eyes behind rimless glasses were clear. Private is where misattribution lives. Cole's smile thinned. And you are? The man nodded toward him with the civility of someone who does not confuse politeness with submission. A spectator with a long memory. He looked at the board, then at Marcus. The derivation is coherent. The identity is tight. If we're going to talk about standards, let's apply them to the process too. Sloane bristled. We are. No, he said softly. You are applying them to the boy. A tremor of something like shame moved across a few faces. Then the dean, practiced in threading needles, turned to the moderator. We cannot ignore optics, she said. If we leave this unresolved tonight, we will be accused of either coddling or railroading. Neither is acceptable. For a suspended moment, the hall became a cathedral of calculation, not of numbers, but of reputations. The board glowed behind Marcus like a witness that could not testify. Whitmore spoke again, and this time he sounded less like an icon and more like a man deciding who he wanted to be. If you must test him, he said, do it honestly. No notebooks for anyone. No drafts. No tricks. A new problem. Unseen. Lit. Cole's head tilted. The suggestion was supposed to be his. You believe he can replicate this on command? I believe mathematics is fairer in public than our politics are in private, Whitmore answered. The donors murmured, intrigued by the prospect of spectacle sanctified as rigor. The moderator saw a way to convert a scandal into a program highlight. His smile returned, managerial and bright. A live test, he said, warming to the idea as if it had always been his. An unprecedented demonstration of intellectual integrity. Sloane nodded slowly. Already editing the future press release. Satisfactory. Provided the problem is selected by faculty. And provided the conditions apply to all. Whitmore added, looking deliberately at Cole. No access to devices. No whispering committees. The board and the mind. Cole folded his hands. Agreeable. He turned to Marcus. Unless you have an objection, Mr. Hill? Marcus scanned the room. The hungry faces. The skeptical ones. The ones too careful to be either. He looked at his father, whose eyes held both warning and pride. Then he looked up at the board, and remembered the feel of the chalk's grit, the way the line becomes the sentence becomes the truth. I'll do it, he said. Aiden exhaled a laugh he tried to swallow. Ambitious. Necessary, Marcus said. The moderator clapped his hands once. The sound too loud in the charged air. Excellent. We will select an equation jointly curated by faculty from mathematics and physics. It will be sealed until presentation. Mr. Hill will approach the board first. Time limit 20 minutes. Garrity frowned. 20. 15. Sloane countered, the smile not reaching her eyes. If he is what he claims, time won't be the issue. 17, Whitmore said, voice flat. Compromise. The number held. Strange and exact. The moderator wrote it on a card, as if engraving law. 17 minutes. Samuel's voice floated from the aisle. A thread pulled through a needle. 17 minutes is a long time to drown if you tie someone's arms. His arms are not tied, Cole replied. Face immaculate. They're merely empty of contraband. The moderator gestured toward a side table. We'll conduct the draw now. A graduate assistant appeared with a sealed envelope and a solemnity that felt rehearsed. The moderator held it up. Within, a problem vetted this afternoon by senior faculty. Marcus watched the envelope with a strange calm. He knew what this was. A test disguised as fairness. Fairness disguised as theater. He let his breath find him again. A rustle moved in the back row. The older man with the cane had slipped into a seat near the aisle. He looked at Marcus, then at Samuel, a glimmer of recognition crossing his face, like a star behind cloud. He leaned forward as if to speak, then thought better of it. His hand tightened briefly on the cane, knuckles pale. The moderator cracked the seal. The sound was small but ceremonial. He slid out a single page, unfolded it without flourish, and froze, as if the page had reached out and grabbed his wrist. What? Sloane asked, impatience knifing her tone. The moderator's smile faltered for the first time all night. It appears, he said carefully, that the selected problem references a technique first proposed in a faculty memorandum from. He glanced at the corner, eyes skimming a signature, from years ago. Cole stepped forward. Hawkfast. Let me see. The moderator shielded the page. After I read it aloud, he cleared his throat and announced the prompt. The line of symbols felt like a corridor leading not only to a solution, but to a history. Even Marcus could hear it, the echo of a mind that had traveled this way before. The older man with the cane closed his eyes. Samuel's breath latched. Whitmore's face changed. Relief, then something darker. as if a door he'd thought bricked over had swung open to a room he'd avoided. The moderator lowered the page. "Mr. Hill, will you approach the board?" Marcus stepped forward, the stage lights gilding the chalk dust on his fingers. The moderator lifted a hand to halt him, and with a voice made to sound neutral, declared, "For the integrity of this symposium, we will now administer an unprecedented measure. Miss Hill will solve this new, unseen equation, live under a 17-minute clock, without pause, prompts or do-overs. Should he falter at any point, the attempt will be terminated." The moderator lifted the page like a priest raising a wafer, performing integrity as if ritual alone could make it real. 17 minutes, he repeated, and nodded to the AV tech in the corner. A red digital clock blinked to life above the board. 17:0, pulsing like a vein. "Mr. Hill," the moderator said, "the board is yours." Marcus stepped forward. The chalk felt small in his fingers, brittle as if it had already decided how this would end. He glanced at the equation, a lean corridor of symbols that turned sharply halfway through, hinting at a technique that didn't belong to most of the people in the room. The air shifted. He heard it rather than felt it, like pressure before a storm. "Begin," the moderator announced. The clock fell to. Marcus inhaled, the way Samuel had taught him before. Hard things, fill the lungs until they had no room for fear. Then let the fear pour out first. He placed the chalk on slate and wrote the first line with care, building the frame rather than chasing the finish. A whisper slid through the front rows. Sloane's voice practiced at sounding neutral. "He'll improvise until the clock embarrasses him." Garrity murmured back, "Unless the pattern really is there." Cole said nothing. He didn't need to. His gaze carried the weight of a verdict waiting for its cue. Marcus wrote the second line, then a third to pin the boundary. He stepped to the side, gauging the geometry of the path. The problem wasn't a wall. It was a doorway disguised as brick. He just had to find the hinge. From the back row, the older man with the cane watched quietly, hands folded around the handle like a promise he'd kept to himself for too long. Samuel stood in the aisle at the edge of light, shoulders squared. There was no mop in his grip tonight, but the posture was the same, steady, deliberate, ready to clean what other people left behind. Whitmore shifted in his seat, trying to read the board and the room at once. He caught Marcus's eye for a fraction of a second. No rescue there, no permission either. Only attention. 15 minutes, the moderator intoned. Marcus moved to the heart of it. "We're going to invert the comfort," he said, voice even, as if explaining to a single student after class. "The expression suggests a substitution most of you will think is reckless. It isn't. It's the lock turning." Aiden laughed under his breath. "He's narrating theatrics." Samuel's voice barely crossed the aisle. "Let him work." Marcus laid the substitution. The chalk squeaked, too soft, too short. It snapped cleanly in his hand, cutting the line mid-stroke. A few clucks of sympathetic tongue. A donor whispered, "Unprofessional supplies." Marcus didn't look down. He picked up the fragment and continued as if the break were the proof's heartbeat. "The trick is not to force symmetry," he said, "but to admit it's already there." He wrote a slender identity on the margin, then lifted it into the main artery of the equation. The move bent the structure without breaking it, like a note modulating into a new key. Sloane's eyes narrowed. "Where did he pick that?" Garrity leaned forward, brows knitting. That's not common." Whitmore's mouth opened, then closed again. He knew the step. He knew where he had first seen it. Not in a journal, not in a colloquium, but in a photocopied memorandum from decades ago, that had vanished into a drawer, that vanished into an office, that vanished into a renovation. The timer flashed 30. Cole spoke at last, voice smooth enough to pass for reason. "You're still only rearranging furniture, Mr. Hill. The house stands." Marcus glanced at him only long enough to say, "Watch the load-bearing wall." He marked a constraint, then moved it, gently and irrevocably, to the far side of the expression. The board changed temperature. A tremor of approval rolled backward from the graduate students, those who knew the feel of a true pivot when it landed. The moderator, trying to sound impartial, said, 12 minutes. Marcus found the hinge. He saw it not as an epiphany, but as recognition, a shape his father used when balancing grocery lists against rent, when a month's math didn't match a month's mercy. He heard Samuel's voice without looking back. "Count what they don't count, son. That's where truth hides." "I'm counting," Marcus whispered, and released the hinge. The transformation clicked. The left side folded into something friendlier, a contour they could understand if they wanted to. From the back row came the older man's first audible breath, not relief, but acknowledgement. Yes, that step, exactly that step. He leaned forward, cane angled, eyes brightening with a pain that looked like pride. 11 minutes, the moderator called. Sloane raised a hand to her face, touching her cheek in thought. If he gets stuck at the boundary condition, she murmured to Garrity. The narrative still holds. Pressure produces collapse. Garrity didn't answer. He was busy rewriting his own interior script. A student near the wall whispered to a friend. He's pulling it from memory. Or from being right, the friend replied. Marcus worked through the midlines with the economy of someone moving a piano alone. Small shifts that translated to large progress. He did not perform, he repaired. He did not decorate. He defined. The chalk failed again, splintering like ice. He caught the shard and turned it in his fingers, finding a fresh edge. When a tool fails, he said softly, almost to the board, you adjust the grip, not the aim. The timer felt in. Cole drifted closer to the stage, authority masking curiosity. I recognize these last two steps, he announced to the room. We've seen them, internally. Then you should also recognize what comes next, Whitmore said. A quiet in his voice that read as rebuke, if you knew him. He sat forward, elbows on knees, unable to pretend detachment. Marcus paused. Not to stall, not to gather, but to decide whether a name should live on the board that night. He looked at the margin where his identity had sprung the lock. He knew who had carried that move into the halls before everyone forgot him. He knew because the technique had lived in a story. Samuel told when Marcus was 13, about a visiting lecturer whose brilliance was treated like a rumor, a name pressed against his mouth, asking to exist. He wrote it, small and neat, in the corner green shift. A wave of static moved across the auditorium. Soft shouts swallowed into hands, chairs creaking, eyes darting. The older man with the cane closed his eyes as if something he had been holding finally landed. Whitmore flinched gently, like a man who'd just heard his own confession read aloud. Sloane's voice flattened. What is that supposed to be? Credit, Marcus said. Cole's jaw tightened. Unrecognized nomenclature has no place here. Recognition's the point, Marcus replied and returned to the line. 8 minutes, the moderator said, and the number sounded like a threat someone had tried to dress in neutral clothes. Marcus reached the boundary condition Sloane was praying for. He examined it from left, then right, then back through the identity. The move required trust, less in himself than in the structure he'd been building. He placed a small inequality, then a limit behavior, then nudged the expression across the thinnest bridge in the room. Aiden whispered, too loud. He's going to slip. Samuel's voice, to no one and to his son alone. Step where the stone is. Marcus stepped. The bridge held. The room made a sound, half gasp, half groan, as if it had hoped otherwise and was embarrassed to be disappointed. He didn't celebrate. He kept moving. Reduction, consolidation, the kind of careful pruning that makes shape out of growth. He wiped the board once with the side of his hand, leaving a chalk crescent on his palm like a moon he didn't have time to admire. 6 minutes. He accelerated slightly, not to hurry, but because the road was smooth now. He could see the end. A clean equivalence not flashy enough for donors, but honest enough for theorems. He underlined a coefficient, marked the cancellation, that had eluded the earlier attempts, and let the expression resolve. Sloane sat back, shoulders rising as if bracing for impact. It could still collapse, she said, less to Garrity than to herself. Garrity shook his head, almost smiling. No. He's past the weak points. Cole, nearest the stage now, tried one final intervention. Mr. Hill, before you finish, state the provenance of this approach. Was it taught to you by any member of faculty? Marcus didn't turn. It was taught to me by a man this university buried under a memo. Silence answered before people did. The timer flashed. Marcus placed the penultimate line. It was not dramatic, just correct. He checked each prior step with a glance, the kind of sweep a violinist gives a bow before the last measure. He breathed in, slow. The board had stopped being a surface a while ago. It was a path. 2 minutes, the moderator said, voice catching, because the numbers had become personal. Marcus lifted the chalk for the final stroke. The fragment was smaller than a thumbnail. He pinched it gently, mindful not to crush it between pressure and purpose. Stop, Cole said suddenly. Before you finish, you will submit your notebook to. Samuel's voice cut him, calm enough to carry. Let him finish. Whitmore didn't move, but something in him did. Let him finish, he echoed. The older man with the cane sat perfectly still, eyes open wide and full, as if he had decided that blinking would be disrespect. 60 seconds, the moderator warned, almost whispering. Sloane leaned forward. If he writes the wrong equivalence, we end this. If, Garrity said, and his voice held a new texture, respect, reluctant and real. Marcus set the chalk to slate, hand steady, mind quiet, body as still as a page. He drew the last line with the ease of someone finally writing what had been true for a long time. The fragments snapped at the dot of the final equality. The room inhaled as one organism. Donors, critics, students, janitors, dean, professor, and a man who remembered his own name like a secret people had asked him to keep. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then all at once, reactions collided in the air. One sharp laugh of disbelief, one swallowed sob, a dozen phones rising, not to accuse but to witness. Sloane's hand flying to her necklace. Garrity half standing, Aiden staring as if the ground had tipped. Marcus wasn't watching them. He was watching the board at the way the solution had simplified not into a trumpet blast, but into a bell, pure and inevitable. Time, the moderator whispered, forgetting to say the number. The last fleck of chalk fell from Marcus's fingers, and before anyone could speak, the older man rose on his cane and said, clear enough to cut through the room, that final line belongs to me, because the university erased it from print 30 years ago. The hall gasped as he stepped into the light, and Samuel's eyes widened in recognition. The last line of Marcus's proof still glowed on the board, the chalk dust shimmering faintly in the harsh light of Chapman Hall. For a suspended moment, it seemed as though the room itself might tip toward honesty. Then the silence fractured, not into applause, but into possession. Professor Sloane was the first to move. She rose with the precision of someone stepping into a role, rehearsed 100 times. Her voice carried an elegance sharpened into a blade. This, she announced, gesturing toward the board, is not original work. What we've witnessed is a reproduction of a theorem long circulated, though perhaps not formally published. A commendable recitation, yes. But originality? Genius? No. Her words landed with the weight of gavel strikes. The crowd leaned forward, some nodding, others eager to believe the theft rather than the truth. Marcus's chest tightened. He had anticipated skepticism, but not theft so blatant, so public. You're saying I copied this? His voice was steady, though his hands trembled at his sides. Sloane clasped her hands together in front of her. The very image of civility. Not saying, confirming, you've reproduced steps nearly identical to existing drafts. Drafts accessible only to faculty. How? I wonder, did a janitor's son stumble into them? The emphasis hung deliberate. Janitor's son. The phrase struck like a slap, dragging Marcus's lineage into evidence against him. The murmurs rose again, growing sharper. Samuel shifted near the doorway, his jaw locking tight. He had heard the word janitor used like a leash his entire life. Tonight, they were trying to bind his son with the same chain. Whitmore stood, his voice low but firm. Professor Sloane, that's an accusation without proof. This work is consistent with independent derivation. Cole cut in before the argument could gain balance. Daniel, spare us. The boy's memory trick impressed the students. That doesn't make it scholarship. It makes it mimicry. Laughter rippled. A cruel, relieved laughter, as if the audience had been waiting for permission to downgrade Marcus from genius to impersonator. Marcus forced himself to breathe. He thought of the nights he had hunched over notebooks, the thrill of patterns unfolding under his pencil, the ache in his fingers when he wrote past exhaustion. None of it was mimicry. It was his language. His heartbeat translated into numbers. I didn't copy anyone, he said, louder this time. Every step came from my work, from me. Cole sneered. A convenient claim. And tell me, Mr. Hill, where did you learn the green shift? It's absent from undergraduate curriculum. Absent from textbooks. A ghost technique. Yet you produce it tonight with perfect ease. Marcus faltered. He had written it deliberately, to give credit to the man whose story his father once told. He hadn't expected it to become ammunition. Sloane's lips curved into the faintest smile. Unless, of course, someone whispered it to you. Someone with access to archives better suited to tenure than tutoring. The accusation turned again. Not only theft, but collusion. The auditorium's air thickened, carrying the stench of disbelief disguised as fairness. Samuel stepped forward. Enough, he said, His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. You're not protecting standards. You're protecting pride. Cole didn't look at him. Sir, your son is welcome to remain enrolled, if he accepts boundaries appropriate to his station. Tonight he overstepped. This, he gestured broadly, dismissively at the board. This will be treated as a misunderstanding, a mimicry, nothing more. The word station curled through the air like a lash. Samuel's fists clenched at his sides, but he did not move closer. He had spent decades knowing what happened to black men, who raised their voices in rooms like this. Marcus's heart hammered. His proof, the hours of thought, the courage it had taken to stand at the board. They were twisting it all into theft. He was no longer the boy who had solved the impossible. He was the janitor's son, who had stolen brilliance and paraded it as his own. He looked toward Whitmore, hoping for rescue. The professor's lips parted, but before he could speak, Sloane raised her hand. No further debate. The symposium cannot devolve into theatrics. Recognition must be preserved for legitimate contribution. This, she tapped the chalkboard with her fingernail, leaving a white crescent, is not legitimate. Phones captured every second. Online, Marcus would be carved into caricature before dawn. The story would not be of a boy solving the unsolvable, but of an imposter exposed. He swallowed hard. You're erasing me. Cole leaned forward, smiling with the calm cruelty of certainty. Correction, we're erasing error. For a second Marcus felt small again. Smaller than the lecture hall whispers. Smaller than the mean page jokes. Smaller than the mop his father carried down Ivywood's corridors. But then his father's voice echoed inside him, steady as a metronome. Truth doesn't need applause, it just needs to shine. He lifted his chin. Erase me, if you want. The math won't vanish. The hall went quiet, not because he had convinced them, but because defiance itself was unexpected. The silence wasn't respect, it was anticipation, waiting for the hammer to fall. And then, from the back row, a voice spoke. It was raspy, aged, but clear. That final line belongs to me, because this university erased it from print 30 years ago. Every head turned. The older black man with the cane was no longer hidden in the shadows. He had risen, standing tall despite his frailty. His voice filled the hall with the authority of someone who had been silenced too long. My name is Dr. Charles Green, and before you dismiss him, know this. You dismissed me first. Gasps erupted. Sloane stiffened. Cole's eyes narrowed, and Whitmore sank into his seat as though a ghost had just entered the room. Marcus froze, his heart pounding with disbelief. Green. The name he had written in the corner. The name his father had once spoken like a secret. Samuel's eyes widened, recognition flashing like lightning. The audience, stunned, leaned forward, every whisper silenced by the weight of revelation. Dr. Green steadied himself on his cane, his gaze locked on Marcus. You didn't steal that proof, son. You revived it. And it's time they heard what they buried. The room stilled as Dr. Charles Green's name rippled across it like a stone dropped into dark water. His presence was unexpected, almost spectral, and yet undeniable. Every eye fixed on him as he steadied himself on his cane, his weathered hand curled around the polished wood. His voice, though raspy with age, cut through the hall's charged air with a force that no microphone could have amplified. You erased me once, Green said, his eyes sweeping across the faculty rows, and you won't do it again, not to him. Gasps fluttered in the auditorium. Some leaned in, fascinated by the sudden fracture in the carefully controlled narrative. Others recoiled, as though the very act of Green speaking threatened to unravel their certainty. Sloane's face tightened, lips pressed so firmly together that the corners whitened. Cole adjusted his tie, his expression measured, calculating the weight of this new complication. Marcus stared, breath caught in his chest. He had written Green's name in the margin, as an act of quiet tribute, never expecting to summon the man himself. And yet here he was, flesh, blood, memory. The name had not just belonged to a story his father told. It belonged to a man who carried decades of erasure in his bones. Green began to walk slowly down the aisle, each step deliberate, his cane tapping against the polished floor. The sound was rhythmic, defiant, like a second heartbeat filling the space. When I was his age, Green continued, nodding toward Marcus, I stood in front of a board, just like that one. I derived a method that should have changed the field. My professors told me it was clever but unpublishable. Too derivative, they said. Months later, I watched the same method appear in a journal, under another man's name. The audience stirred, the younger scholars exchanging looks. The weight of Green's words pressed against the walls. I protested. Green went on. I was told I misunderstood, that I must have confused my notes with something I read. I hadn't. But they closed ranks. They questioned my memory, my credibility, even my sanity. And just like that, my name was erased from my own work. He paused at the foot of the stage. His gaze swept upward to meet Sloane, then Cole, then Whitmore, who looked as though the floor beneath him had shifted. They called it academic rigor, Green said, his voice hardening, but it was racism dressed in robes and titles. They told me to stay quiet if I wanted a future. I stayed quiet and the future was denied to me anyway. A ripple of silence fell. Even the rustle of paper had ceased. Marcus gripped the edge of the chalk tray, his knuckles pale. Green's words weren't history to him. They were prophecy he had barely escaped. The same theft that had silenced Green now threatened to bury him. Now, Green said, turning to Marcus, I see a young man carrying the same burden. He's not mimicking. He's not performing. He's blazing the path I once carved and they once covered over. Whitmore rose suddenly. His voice cracked, heavy with something Marcus had never heard in it before. Regret. Charles, I was there. I didn't stop it. The hall froze. Green's eyes locked on Whitmore. No, you didn't. You knew my work was mine. But silence is easier than sacrifice, isn't it? Whitmore bowed his head. I was a coward. The admission shocked the audience almost as much as Green's testimony. To hear the institution's brightest star confess complicity rattled the room's balance. Sloane stood, her composure fraying. This is irrelevant. Ancient grievances, real or imagined, have no bearing on tonight. We are here to judge Mr. Hill's conduct, not relitigate the past. Ancient grievances? Green's voice cracked like a whip. The past is the present when the same theft repeats itself in the body of another black scholar. You dismissed me then. Now you dismiss him. The legacy isn't mine alone. It's this institution. A low murmur spread through the hall. Students in the back row leaned forward, their phones already capturing history. Professors exchanged uneasy glances. Some nodded slightly, hesitant but acknowledging. Doubt was blooming, where certainty had reigned. Cole adjusted his cuffs. His voice was smooth, but his jaw was tense. Dr. Green, stories of personal disappointment, however compelling, do not change the fact that Mr. Hill's work matches drafts in circulation. Then show the drafts, Green snapped, his frail body suddenly taut with steel. Name them, cite them, bring them into the light, or admit you're using smoke to choke a fire you can't control. For the first time, Cole faltered. He looked toward the dean, but the dean's expression was unreadable, wary of aligning too openly. Samuel stepped forward, his voice low, almost trembling with the weight of memory. I told my boy about you, Dr. Green. I told him how they buried your name. He wrote it on the board tonight because he knew truth without credit is theft. He wasn't stealing, he was giving back what they took from you. Green's face softened. His eyes glistened as he looked at Samuel. Recognition flickered. Samuel Hill, you were a boy when I last saw you. I remember your father. He used to wait outside classrooms, cleaning as I packed up. You've carried the silence longer than I have. Samuel nodded, his throat thick. Too long. The hall was no longer simply an auditorium. It was a courtroom of history, memory, and wounds reopened. The accusers had not expected this, had not expected the past to step forward and testify in flesh and voice. Marcus felt his chest swell with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Green's story was his story, and his father's, and countless others. He was not alone. He was part of a lineage of brilliance deliberately erased. The moderator cleared his throat, desperate to regain order. This is highly irregular. Testimony of grievances outside the present matter. Outside the matter? Green thundered, his cane striking the floor like a gavel. The matter is erasure. The matter is theft. The matter is what happens when black minds shine too brightly in halls that want them to sweep, not to lead. Silence followed, deep and raw. For once, no one dared laugh. No one dared dismiss. Marcus looked at Green, then at his father, then at the faces of the crowd. The truth had been spoken, but he knew truth was not always enough. Systems were designed to outlast truth, to smother it beneath process and bureaucracy. The dean finally stood. Her voice was calm, but beneath it pulsed the tension of an institution fighting for survival. Given the seriousness of the claims, and the disruption to this symposium. The university's board will convene a formal hearing. Mr. Hill, you will be required to defend your work before us. Only then will a decision be rendered. A wave of whispers surged through the hall. Some looked relieved. Justice packaged neatly into procedure. Others looked alarmed. Justice delayed. Perhaps denied. Marcus's stomach tightened. The proof wasn't enough. The testimony wasn't enough. They would drag him into a courtroom of chalk and politics, where truth had to survive translation into rules made by the very people it threatened. Samuel stepped closer, placing a steady hand on his son's back. Green lifted his cane in a faint salute. Whitmore sank further into his chair, his silence now louder than words. The clock above the board still glowed faintly red, though time had long since run out. The dean's voice cut through the murmurs, final and sharp. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and be warned, Mr. Hill. If you fail, expulsion will be the least of the consequences. Morning arrived gray and reluctant, the kind of light that carried no warmth. Marcus barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw chalk dust swirling in the air like smoke, saw Dr. Green's cane strike the floor, saw the dean's lips forming the word expulsion. The university board convened in the grand chamber of Halstead Hall, a space meant to impress donors rather than dispense justice. Tall windows spilled cold light across polished oak tables. The portraits of past presidents stared down from the walls, their painted gazes heavy with centuries of exclusion. At the front sat the panel, deans, senior professors, trustees. They looked less like judges, and more like gatekeepers, their suits immaculate, their expressions schooled into neutrality. But neutrality here wasn't impartiality. It was armor. Students crowded the gallery above, whispers ricocheting in nervous currents. Some carried notebooks to record every word. Others clutched phones ready to broadcast. The hearing wasn't just for the board. It was for history, unfolding in real time. Marcus stood at the center table. Samuel sat just behind him, one row back, close enough to lend weight, far enough to be excluded from speaking. His father's presence was steady, a lighthouse in a storm. Beside them, Whitmore sat stiff, a silent witness whose face carried lines of regret. The chair of the board, Dr. Evelyn Caro, cleared her throat. Her voice was crisp, practiced. This proceeding is convened to determine whether Mr. Marcus Hill has engaged in academic misconduct, specifically the misappropriation of unpublished mathematical work. We will hear arguments, review evidence, and reach a determination by day's end. She glanced at Marcus. Mr. Hill, you may respond to the allegations after the faculty present their case. The procession began. Professor Sloane rose first, her words smooth as silk but sharp as glass. Colleagues, let us not confuse performance with innovation. Mr. Hill may have memorized lines of a proof, but originality is absent. His sudden facility with advanced techniques, particularly the so-called green shift, suggests exposure to restricted materials. Integrity requires us to ask, how did he acquire it? Her eyes lingered on Samuel when she said acquire, as if to remind the room of back doors and janitor's keys. Next came Garrity, who masked skepticism in the language of fairness. We cannot dismiss the possibility of coincidence, but the alignment of Mr. Hill's solution with draft-level research is troubling. He has neither the academic training nor the publication record to substantiate independent discovery. Without evidence of a legitimate process, we are left with mimicry. The word mimicry circulated again, heavy as a brand. Cole followed, the performance of reason incarnate. Our concern is not to punish enthusiasm. It is to protect standards. If a freshman uncredentialed and unverified can stand before us and claim parity with